B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, November 18th, 2020. And it's just a week to go before my final news and comment podcast as I amble off into retirement. And I have to say, I really have mixed feelings about this. I've never retired before, and I hate to pull the plug on a daily process that is something that I do truly enjoy. But I've been working on deadlines, daily deadlines, for years, and I'm looking forward just to not having a schedule and seeing what comes up and presents itself each day. So today we lead with Donald Trump's desperate maneuvers to flip the presidential election. And at every attempt, he is being stymied. But as he tries desperately to overturn the results in the presidential race in Georgia, it appears that his self-interest may lead to a big loss for the Republicans, and that is control of the U.S. Senate. As you know, Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed, what is she, filling out Johnny Isakson's term, if I have that right, and David Perdue, they're both up for a Senate runoff election in Georgia on January 5th. And the internecine struggles that are underway among Republicans, and we shared yesterday the attacks against the hapless Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. He's a Republican, but he failed to rig the election for Trump, and he has faced the wrath of both Loeffler and Perdue. And on top of that, Trump has thrown in the towel on the Georgia recount, which did actually produce more vote shifts than expected. There are a little over 3,000 votes that were discovered in 3 different counties, votes for Trump. There were a handful of votes in those counties for Biden as well, but it did improve Trump's margin. But he is still losing by some 11,000 votes across Georgia. And it's possible that because the way Trump is playing kingmaker, the way he has signaled that he may run again in 2024, and he's got a pact to raise money so he can sniper tweet and keep people in line for the next 4 years, this creates a real dilemma for the candidates Loeffler and Perdue. Do they stick with Trump as they did last week when they called for the resignation of Brad Raffensperger? Or do they get a little more independent in order to connect with the restive Georgia voters who narrowly gave their state to the Democrats this time? And this is quite a dilemma for them. And it potentially could give new meaning to snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Because, number one, I never expected Georgia to go for Biden. And some of that was because Greg Palast poisoned my mind. And we do plan a post-election look at this whole process with Greg Palast sometime in the next couple of weeks. I haven't scheduled that yet. But we have Doug Collins, who lost out in the Senate primary that was held on November 3rd. He's now heading up Trump's recount effort in Georgia. And he and Raffensperger don't get along because Doug Collins was called a liar by Mr. Raffensperger, and Collins responded by calling Raffensperger incompetent. So there's no love lost there. And so as we head toward January 5th, the Republicans are floating all kinds of dark scenarios, like they're Democrats flooding into Georgia to meet its very, very sketchy or limited resident requirements before you can vote. And there's this one right-wing group that's on my Facebook feed here in San Francisco, and they say, yeah, all kinds of people are going to move into Georgia. They may be subject to perjury because they're going to sign a document that says they intend to stay here, not just for this special election. And I wouldn't doubt that there are some people who may take that opportunity, but there's no indication that it's a strategy of the Democrats. Then we bring in Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, who called Raffensperger. And basically, according to Raffensperger, was saying, hey, can't you throw out a number of votes, find some pretext? All you need is 11,000 statewide, for God's sake. You can flip this back to Trump and regain your stripes as a devout and respected Republican. So this is going to be a very interesting sequence of events. And in coverage of this struggle, this inter-party struggle in Georgia, the New York Times notes that last week, Trump took a Twitter attack out on Governor Mike DeWine of Ohio. Now, DeWine was a former senator. He's in his first term as governor. And he stepped out of line and acknowledged that Biden had won the election, that Trump is a loser. And so as part of this kingmaker role that Trump imagines for himself, he spoke to his cult followers via Twitter, who will be running for governor of the great state of Ohio, will be hotly contested. So Trump is trying to rustle up a primary opponent for Mike DeWine in order to pay him back for, just kind of acknowledging the facts. And in Georgia, opinions are split over whether the intra-party feud will drag down Perdue and Loeffler. There's a fear among some Republicans that disparaging the voting system, which Trump is doing, might convince some Trump voters not to turn out because they think their vote won't count. And others fear that Trump will continue to make a spectacle and dampen the enthusiasm of well-educated, high-propensity voters in the suburbs who have wearied after 4 years of his antics. So this is one to watch. And even though I won't be podcasting every day, I'll be watching with you. And there is the prospect here that where voters failed to elect the Democrats in the preliminary rounds, it wasn't likely in the Loeffler race, but where voters failed, Trump may step in and flip the Senate to the Democrats, which could make a huge difference in how things roll out with a new Biden administration. Now over to Wisconsin. Yesterday, it appeared that the Trump campaign was going to back out. They didn't want to pay the $7 or $8 million to have a full recount across the state of Wisconsin, where Trump is trailing by about 20,000 votes. Now, that lead of Biden's is too big to trigger an automatic recount. So the campaign is close enough, though, to request it. Now they have decided to pay $3 million. They have wired the money, but they've failed so far to provide the paperwork in the form of a petition to the Wisconsin Elections Commission. So the strategery here is similar to what killed the Democrats' efforts in Florida in 2000. When the brilliant advisors to Al Gore said, let's not recount the whole state. Let's just recount the Democratic strongholds and see if we can come up with those 537 votes, which were the margin that Bush enjoyed at that point. And that's when the Supreme Court found the pretext to intervene and say, equal protection. If you're going to do a recount, you got to recount the whole state. So I can't imagine Well, I guess I can, because Rudy Giuliani is now the top lawyer in the Trump post-election team. But it's hard to imagine that it was only 20 years ago. And, of course, we know that Gorsuch and Roberts and the fresh Justice Barrett were all part of the Brooks Brothers mob that went to Florida to stop the recount so that the Supreme Court could intervene. So there's got to be somebody who's got Trump's ear who's saying, hey, Don, what you're doing in Wisconsin is how we trapped Gore in Florida in 2000. And let's just say, since I have no law degree, no experience, that if I know this, I can't be the only one. So the Trump team is asking for recounts in Milwaukee County and Dane County, which is where Madison and the university are. Even former Republican governor knuckle-dragger Scott Walker went on Twitter and said a previous statewide recount in Wisconsin only shifted a few hundred votes. 20,000, he said, is a high hurdle. And yesterday I implied my view that Trump was cheap or doesn't have the cash to pay for a statewide recount. And get this, even if Trump's lawyers were correct or successful, the recount shifts the vote by 20,000. Biden loses those electoral college votes. He would still have 296, which is, according to my math, 26 more than you need to clinch the electoral college vote. So Trump keeps saying that he's been cheated, widespread voter fraud. There's no evidence of that in Wisconsin. In a moment, we'll get to his firing of the appointee of his who declared that the election was the most secure in recent history. And as we pointed out the other day, analysis of the election results show that the three cities that Trump has targeted because they're predominantly black, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Milwaukee, actually produced slightly more votes for Trump when you compare 2016 to 2020. And Joe Biden did not increase the Democratic vote count as compared to Hillary Clinton 4 years ago in any of those three cities. And the one thing I know Trump can do, he has an incredible capacity to store numbers in his head. And so these schemes can only be seen as ways to placate the cultist mob that follows Trump, to play up his sense and theirs of victimization, to keep the country solidly divided for Trump's imagined grand, redemption 4 years from now. It's really hard to put a rational frame around it. Let me just say that. And then there were these antics in Detroit last night. After I posted yesterday's podcast, I was looking at the news online, and it said that the two Republican members of the Wayne County Canvassing Board had refused to certify the results from Detroit and surrounding Wayne County. They didn't really have a reason, except that black people voted in Detroit. Monica Palmer, a Republican board member, made a motion at one point to certify the results in the communities other than the city of Detroit. And an angry Democratic lawyer, Mark Brewer, said, hey, Detroit is 78% black. If you want to certify the rest of the county, including communities like Livonia, a place that I've been, it is midway between Detroit and the suburbs of Plymouth and Northville. Anyway, Livonia has a black population of a mere 4.4%. So Brewer unloaded. Monica Palmer sat there and said she's willing to approve the results of the lily-white city of Livonia, which had the second highest number of out-of-balance precincts. Oh, that was the excuse they used. So this is kind of, deep in the weeds. But there are discrepancies that pop up. Minor number differences between, say, the number of people registered to vote at a precinct and the number of ballots actually submitted. And often there are fewer ballots than voters who signed in, or requested a mail-in ballot. And that is a legitimate issue to look at in the canvassing and in potential recounts. But Brewer makes this point, that the lily-white city of Livonia had the second highest number of out-of-balance precincts, and Detroit was not number one, okay? So Trump is keeping this alive. He continues to tweet false statements like, "I won the election." And this dust-up in Detroit last night is really just the latest example. And what is important here is that after a round of public input, the members of this committee took a pause and came back, and Monica Palmer and her other Republican board member, they changed their minds. They certified Wayne County. And then Trump falsely tweeted that, let's see, he said he stated incorrectly that Michigan, and not just Wayne County, had refused to certify the election results, and that having courage is a beautiful thing. So Trump is still trying to create his own reality for his mob of followers, and putting Rudy Giuliani in charge of many of these frivolous lawsuits is a deep embarrassment, including to America's mayor. So for the first time in years, Rudy Giuliani was originally a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. So he made an appearance in the federal courtroom of District Judge Matthew Brann. And he made these specious arguments without evidence that Republican voters in the state were illegally disadvantaged because some Democratic-leaning counties allowed voters to fix errors on their mail-in ballots. There were 2 voters named as co-plaintiffs with Trump's campaign in the long-shot lawsuit who had their ballots voided and alleged that they were not given a chance to correct their mistakes. So the judge got pretty irritated with Giuliani, and he said, "You're alleging that the 2 individual plaintiffs were denied the right to vote. And you're asking this court to invalidate more than 6.8 million votes, disenfranchising every single voter in the Commonwealth? Can you tell me how this result can possibly be justified?" And so then Giuliani trotted out these claims about Republican observers being denied the right to watch votes being counted. And the judge said, "The poll-watching claims were deleted. They are not now before this court, so why should I consider them?" So Giuliani was either intentionally obfuscating, or he didn't know the status of the suit that he was arguing before this judge. So he acknowledged that those claims had been deleted, and then he said the campaign would file a 3rd version of its lawsuit to restore those allegations. And then the Judge Brann appeared to ask him a question that Giuliani didn't know the answer to. The question was, what standard of review should apply in this case? And Giuliani punted, "I think the normal one." And at a different moment, Giuliani said, "I'm not quite sure what opacity means. It probably means you can see." And the judge said, "No, It means you can't. So the Democrats asked for the case to be dismissed. Judge Brand declined to do so. He set a deadline of 5 p.m. today, which has now passed, for the president's team to file a motion opposing the election officials' attempt to dismiss the lawsuit. This, too, appeared to confuse Giuliani, who asked if the judge was inviting him to file the retooled third version of the lawsuit that he'd promised earlier. Brand replied, "This is a brief in opposition to their motion to dismiss." "Oh," Giuliani said. "Oh, sure. Absolutely." So this only fools the people who want to be fooled, and that would be a large number of Trump supporters. Because their guy Giuliani is right there, taking it to the Democrat judges in the Democrat cities and Democrat-run states where all this kind of vote rigging occurs on a regular basis. The Guardian did an analysis of whether there is still any potential for Trump to pull this long-shot strategy where a Republican-dominated state would set aside the decision of the voters, saying that the election could not be relied upon for whatever excuse they can summon, and therefore the legislature must step in and name its own slate of electors who would presumably all be pro-Trump. So the Guardian does this in a Q&A format. Q. Trump refuses to accept that Biden won the election. Is there a constitutional path for him to stage a coup and stay in office for another term? A. Not really. The Electoral College meets on December 14 to cast its vote for president. Nearly every state uses the statewide popular vote to allocate its electors. Biden is projected to win far more than the 270 he needs to become president. His victory doesn't hinge on one state, and he probably has insurmountable leads in Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. There's this long-shot legal theory floated by Republicans that Republican-friendly legislatures in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania could ignore the popular vote and appoint their own electors. Federal law allows legislatures to do this if states have failed to make a choice by the day that the Electoral College meets. But there is no evidence of systemic fraud or wrongdoing in any state, and Biden's commanding margins make it clear that the states have, in fact, made a choice. Next Q. Is there any indication Republicans in these important states are going to go along with this? Well, in Pennsylvania, the top Republican in the state Senate, Jake Corman, shortly after Election Day, indicated that his party would follow the law in Pennsylvania, which requires awarding electors to the winner of the popular vote. And back in October in an op-ed, he said the legislature does not have and will not have a hand in choosing the state's presidential electors or in deciding the outcome of the presidential election. Can we trust that? Not entirely. Next Q. Is this related in any way to the lawsuits Trump is filing? A. Trump's campaign has filed a slew of legally dubious suits since Election Day. The purpose appears not to be actually to overturn the election results, but to try to create uncertainty and draw out the counting process. Each state has its own deadlines for certifying election results that are then used to allocate its Electoral College votes. In at least Pennsylvania and Michigan, Trump's campaign is seeking to block officials from certifying those results. And the final Q, say the worst-case scenario comes to fruition and Republican-led legislatures override the will of the people in several states. Is there any safeguard to stop Trump? And essentially the answer is most of these states have Democratic governors. Theoretically, they can veto the work of their legislature, although there are some arguments that, at least under some state constitutions, the governor may not have a veto. So I would say at this point that it seems far-fetched, but it is still not ruled out. Christopher Krebs is the guy who is the latest victim of a tweeted termination from the stable genius. Krebs was running the Department of Homeland Security operation that was set up to monitor the elections and also to protect infrastructure in the country. He was running the CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And Chris Krebs used to be an executive at Microsoft, and he's received high marks from leaders of both parties for trying to protect the election and other infrastructure from any kind of domestic or foreign assault. And last week, when he joined others in signing on to a report saying that there was no chicanery in this election, there was no foreign meddling, again, that's my insertion, that, no significant numbers of dead people voted. Well, Krebs has been telling people since May that he expected to get fired right after the election. And here was the claim made by Trump in his termination tweet. The recent statement by Chris Krebs on the security of the 2020 election was highly inaccurate, in that there were massive improprieties and fraud, including dead people voting, poll watchers not allowed into polling locations, glitches in the voting machines which changed votes from Trump to Biden, late voting, and many more. He said Krebs has been terminated as director of the agency. And I don't think he even wished him well. So it's really sad to see this desperate man who's so petty and vindictive. And again, he does this to show his base how hard he's fighting to save his own ass, and that the pre-election rigging didn't work well enough, and so now he's got to move to these post-election interventions. He's looking for, as the Greeks would put it, deus ex machina. It's essentially a miracle. And to what end? It's been more than 2 weeks since the election, more than 10 days since it was called for Biden. And Trump continues to maintain that he was the winner. He's the victim of major larceny. Yesterday he tweeted, this is on Monday night, he tweeted claiming a big victory in Clark County, Nevada, because the election officials voted to rerun one local race that had a margin of just 10 votes. And Trump described that as a large-scale voter discrepancy. I wish I were making this stuff up. Allies of Trump are spreading another baseless rumor about computer-based vote manipulation. They refer to a software company in Barcelona, Spain, called SCYTL, Cytel. They make software for local election officials, and their theory alleges that the U.S. Army recently raided Cytel's office in Frankfurt, Germany, seized a computer server containing authentic vote totals for the 2020 election, and this undoctored data shows that Trump was not defeated, but instead won in a landslide with 410 electoral votes. Oh, really? You got to go to Frankfurt to see that, huh? There's also a conservative website promoting a rumor that a high-level staff member in Texas for the Biden campaign was arrested on charges of voter fraud for his role in supposedly helping to orchestrate a ballot harvesting scheme. The news seemed to acquire additional credibility when supporters of Trump began circulating a picture purporting to show the staff member named Dallas Jones in handcuffs being escorted by police officers. And I don't have all of the details here, but Jones called the rumors lies. And that's the latest from there. So a memo leaked from staff members at Facebook to BuzzFeed shows that when Trump lies, And Facebook puts up a notice, essentially a link to the truth, to counter Trump's post, that it only changes the impact by about 8%. To some extent, it makes it more attractive to people who click on it because it has been tagged as questionable or challenged. And this memo followed a question that was raised by a Facebook employee about the effectiveness of these labels. So a data scientist revealed that they do very little to reduce the inaccurate or false posts from being shared. Quote, "We have evidence that applying these informs, is what they're called, to posts decreases their reshares by about 8%. However, given that Trump has so many shares on any given post, the decrease is not going to change shares by orders of magnitude." The data scientist noted that adding the labels was not expected to reduce the spread of false content. Instead, it's used to provide factual information in content to the post. And Zuck's official mouthpiece, Liz Bourgeois, said, "Ahead of this election, we developed informational labels, which we applied to candidate posts with the goal of connecting people with reliable sources about the election." But simply putting up what is considered to be factual information in the face of a big lie, I don't think does very much. We don't have data on how many people actually click through to read the full statement. When Facebook or Twitter says, this is misleading, this has been challenged, here are the real results of the election. So this is a sorry situation. Because, as you know, I am not a promoter of censorship. And I also understand that under the current setup, that Facebook and Twitter do not operate under the First Amendment. But they do have their own community standards, these operating rules. And they allow Trump to repeatedly violate them without suspending him or banning him from these platforms altogether. And that's what they should do. He is a congenital, proven liar who has used his distribution to get around the media, which attempts to check his lying. And Facebook and Twitter are enablers of the widespread deceit, the known 20,000 plus lies that he has told in the last 4 years. And they continue to profit from the mess that they've created. So here is our big aha moment. For months now, Trump was arguing that mail-in ballots were a recipe for fraud and disaster, that dead people will be voting, that ballot harvesting is going to make it impossible for Democrats to get reelected. So in the city of Hawthorne, which is in Los Angeles County, I want to make it very clear, this little plot of election fraud had nothing to do with the presidential race. In fact, the people who perpetrated it on behalf of candidate Carlos Antonio de Bourbon Montenegro, age 53, they failed because he didn't even show up on the list of people who secured votes in the campaign for mayor of Hawthorne. So Montenegro worked with Marcos Arevalo, a 34-year-old. They've been charged with multiple counts of voter fraud after allegedly trying to register 8,000 fictitious, non-existent, or deceased voters to receive mail-in ballots. And these idiots, these people have less skill than some of the looters we saw on television this summer. Court records show at least 29 mail-in ballots were issued to people Montenegro and Arevalo had allegedly signed up or made up. But none of the ballots were actually submitted and counted in the election. They repeatedly used Montenegro's home address on many of the applications. Brilliant. And they use similar or identical Social Security numbers. So, I mean, this is a Keystone Cops approach. But I have to raise the real possibility that they were inspired by the ravings of Donald Trump. That they said, maybe Trump has a point. You can rig mail-in elections. Let's do it. So Montenegro is facing 18 counts of voter fraud, 2 counts of perjury, many other misdemeanors. He faces up to 15 years in prison if he is convicted. Nancy Pelosi has a pretty strong lock on the speakership. Her caucus has essentially indicated that they will give her the votes in January when the House is organized for the new session. But it is a razor-thin margin. She's had a 35-seat majority for the past 2 years. And while some of the races still haven't been called, the projections are she is going to have a 4-seat majority for the next 2 years. And it is time for transition. Pelosi is 80. And while I think she's done a good job as Speaker the last couple of years, I question her decision on how to impeach Trump, not if. But Steny Hoyer, her number 2, is 81. James Clyburn, the number 3, is 80. And so it's time for some fresh blood. So they're promoting Catherine Clark of Massachusetts, a progressive, to be the assistant speaker. That's the 4th-ranking position. Hakeem Jeffries, who's a mere 50-year-old, has been named the chairman of the Democratic caucus. So they are being groomed to be the successors. I'm sorry to see that Karen Bass of Los Angeles is not included in that list. I think she's a former Speaker of the California Assembly and a woman of, I think, remarkable political skills. So I want to share with you another loving email. This one came from Jessica. I believe she's in Indiana. Oh, Peter, she writes, I just heard the news of your leaving your show. My world just got a little smaller. You are a radio broadcast national treasure, and this is a big loss, especially at this point of time. I'll miss your even-keeled, insightful commentaries as well as your special snark that just cuts through the subject matter. Well, thanks for that. And she mentions that she is a regular listener to Ian Masters, The Background Briefing, Gaslight Nation, and Democracy Now! So thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate that. And let me remind you that a week from today will be my final news and comment podcast. Tomorrow I start recording what I'm calling the Last Interview series, and I'll be presenting those roughly one a day or, as they come along into early December. And after that, I'm going to occasionally repost some of my favorite past interviews from the archives. The website and the archives will remain online indefinitely, so feel free to drop by. And if you want to be on my alert list, should I break my silence sometime in the next year, I don't think it'll be much longer than that, make sure I have your email address. So if you've been a recent subscriber, let's say up to and including October, I have your email address through that database. If not, send me an email to be on the alert list and send tips, like Jessica did, of other podcasts or media outlets that you recommend. And once again, I want to underscore that if you are a current subscriber, I am asking you to go to PayPal and cancel your payment order, whether it's $5, $10, $20 a month or the $50 annual, so that we don't continue to charge you for something that you're no longer getting. As you know, while I've been, a little bit queasy about the moves that Trump has made at the Pentagon, purging people and bringing in loyalists, if in fact his goal is simply to go through the motions of bringing some troops home 2,500 from Afghanistan, 500 from Iraq. I'm okay with that. I don't think they're going to make a big difference, in the hand-wringing that we're seeing, particularly from Democrats and from Democratic-aligned former spooks like John Brennan. I think that's a lot of malarkey, as somebody would say. And when you couple the drawdowns, they're not a full withdrawal, with Trump's desire to attack Iran, even though his top advisors have said, no, Don, you don't want to do that. Apparently he has relented. But just to send a little message, there was a missile strike on the Green Zone in Baghdad today, home of the massive U.S. embassy. And it is being blamed on an Iranian-backed Iraqi militia group. And this could be a signal from the Ayatollah and Rouhani, the Prime Minister of Iran. Don't mess with Tehran. The attack came less than an hour after the announcement of the withdrawal of 500 troops from Iraq. And we see a big pushback. Democrats who were against the Iraq war when it was Bush's war, they're now saying, oh, isn't this precipitous? Isn't this dangerous? Well, I will concede that the way Trump does things is not ideal. But it's apparent that he's been lied to by the Pentagon, that they have used underhanded methods to block his orders to withdraw troops from Iraq and Afghanistan. And so he's taking what appear to be more extreme measures. And today, over at consortiumnews.com, William J. Astori zeroes in on the discomfort that this causes to one Jay Johnson. He was Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security, and he worked at the Pentagon before that. And he's a popular guest on MSNBC. And he's quoted from one of the Sunday talk shows this past weekend. If Trump wants troops out of Afghanistan, as I know most Americans do, we have to do it in a way that makes sense, in an orderly manner, that comports with battlefield reality. In trying to strike a deal, you don't unilaterally surrender your greatest point of leverage by unilaterally withdrawing troops before the Afghan government and the Taliban have stuck a deal. So this is very concerning. And if I were in the Biden transition team right now, I'd be very focused on restoring stability in our national security. And Astori argues, we can't surrender our leverage, those thousands of U.S. troops that remain in harm's way in an unnecessary war that was won and then lost almost 2 decades ago, because it's that leverage that will compel the Taliban, who've already won the war, to strike a deal with an Afghan government that exists mainly because the U.S. government props it up. And as you know, Obama declared some sort of victory in Afghanistan, pulled most of the troops out before he left, and he did execute the Bush administration's plan initially to withdraw our troops from Iraq. And that was before the rise of ISIS, the U.S.-backed covert destabilization campaign in Syria, and on and on. So one of the things that I observe here as I get ready to hang up my headphones and say goodbye to this podcast, is that I have witnessed the Democrats move from an anti-war party, an anti-imperialist party, to a pro-war, pro-imperialist, pro-Pentagon point of view. They have rewritten many of the policies of the party. They have recruited these former soldiers and spooks like Abigail Spanberger, who's been mentioned frequently because of her critical comments of progressives post-election. And so the Democratic Party, which I left in the 1990s, has truly transformed. And it's why $1 billion spent on trying to retake the Senate led to flipping 2 seats that were not that long shot. But Mitch McConnell didn't go down, John Cornyn didn't go down, Lindsey Graham didn't go down. And I believe because I think it's Michael Moore who said that the Democrats are diet Republicans. And I think that lack of a difference is not lost on voters today. I want to give a shout out to some pacifists who are about to go to federal prison. Carmen Trotta. He's from the Plowshares Group, the anti-nuclear Christian pacifist movement. And together with Martha Hennessy, Claire Grady, and Patrick O'Neill, they are due to report to prison within the next few months. Why? Because they took direct action. They broke into the naval base in Brunswick, Georgia, armed only with vials of their own blood, hammers, video cameras, spray paint, protest banners, and Daniel Ellsberg's book. They symbolically attempted to disarm the nuclear weapons located at the Trident submarines at Brunswick. This took place on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and it has gotten very little media attention. And all but one of these activists have quietly been sentenced in their faith-based battle with the government in recent weeks. Trotta, Hennessy, and Grady were sentenced in individual virtual court sessions. Trotta will be sentenced to 14 months, Grady 12 months, and Hennessy was sentenced to 12 months. We await sentencing for the final defendant here, Mark Colville. But I honor and respect their decision to put their bodies on the line and their freedom on the line to raise attention to America's deadly nuclear arsenal. And, well, we've heard about a whole lot of lip service about reducing it. That came from Obama 1.0. And then Obama 2.0 spent billions, if not trillions, to update and upgrade our nuclear arsenal. That's not what they gave him the Nobel Peace Prize for, but it's another reason why he should give it back. A federal judge today, and he's the same judge, Emmett Sullivan, who has been presiding over the Michael Flynn case. He ruled against the Trump administration and the Department of Homeland Security for their unsustainable and inexcusable practice of not only refusing asylum to unaccompanied minors who appear at the border, but the instant deportation of more than 13,000 of these immigrant children just since March. The pretext was, well, they've all got COVID and we can't let them into the country. Judge Sullivan rejected that. And Lee Gallant from the ACLU, who's been doing a great job fighting Stephen Miller, Chad Wolf, Ken Cuccinelli, these temporary appointees at DHS. Gallant said today's ruling is a critical step in halting the Trump administration's unprecedented and illegal attempt to expel children under the thin guise of public health. The administration's order has already allowed for the rapid expulsion of more than 13,000 children in need of protection who were legally entitled to apply for asylum. Under the old practice, they had to refer minors to a refugee resettlement entity of the government within 72 hours. But those referrals dropped precipitously after the coronavirus order, and instead the children are turned back immediately or held briefly until they can put them on a plane and return them to harm's way in their native countries. A federal appeals court early today refused to delay the scheduled execution of 2 prisoners, including one set for tomorrow in Terre Haute, Indiana, where they will snuff the life out of Orlando Hall. And Brandon Bernard will be executed on schedule probably in December. This adds up to 13 executions since Bill Barr and Trump reinstated them back in July. There are significant legal issues about the pentobarbital that is used to execute people and whether it produces the sensation of drowning and suffocation in the process of killing them. And efforts to delay the execution until the Biden administration takes office, that is being thwarted. And it is notable that while Joe Biden has a terrible record on many criminal justice issues, he is a longtime opponent of the death penalty, and we'll see how he acts on that position. Boeing has announced that the FAA has given clearance for the 737 MAX to resume flying. Now, it won't be tomorrow. There's a whole routine here where pilots need to be retrained in simulators, and the planes will be inspected for up to 1,000 hours. But I really raise questions about this because it was the FAA that failed to properly monitor the development of the 737 MAX and the shortcut used, which was a piece of software called MCAS, which has been held responsible for pushing the nose down on the two planes that crashed with the loss of hundreds of lives. And the head of the FAA is a retired pilot, Stephen Dixon. He has test flown a 737 MAX recently. He says he would let his family fly on one. Would you? Because fundamentally, the 737 MAX was a cheat. Instead of designing a whole new airliner from the ground up, they modified the frame of the existing 737, and they put different engines on. They had to do a lot to compensate. And if you do any kind of carpentry, you know what a shim is, right? That's when you do something that isn't square, doesn't fit, and so you cheat. You put a little shim in there. And that's my metaphor for what Boeing did with the MAX. The FAA did not carefully monitor the construction of these new planes and the modifications that were made to cut corners and cut costs. As you may know, the Attorney General of the state of New York, Letitia James, is working to take down the National Rifle Association, to shut it down. And one phase of that is that the NRA has agreed to pay a $2.5 million fine and to suspend for 5 years its insurance business in the state of New York. Now, the insurance deal was a licensing deal with an insurance broker. They sold 28,000 policies to New Yorkers, and essentially it would cover them if they used their guns in an intentional manner in what would be called self-defense or other uses. So James accused the NRA of misleading gun collectors, dealers, instructors, clubs, and shows by promising coverage at the lowest possible cost when the NRA was pocketing 14 to 22% of the premium revenues. Here's today's COVID-19 update, prepared by Linda Lewis. And once again, we see the numbers climbing. Here in the United States, we're at 11.4 million total cases. Yesterday, we had 159,000 new cases reported. We have just under 250,000 deaths, and yesterday's death count was 1,538. Doctors on the White House Coronavirus Task Force have stressed to VP Pence that the pandemic situation is dire and only getting worse. The doctors fear that the U.S. could see an average of 1,500 deaths a day next week, just like we had reported today, and up to 2,000 per day by Christmas, unless we have changes to the mitigation measures. The doctors on the task force are also concerned that predicted spikes will completely overrun hospitals, force the United States back to the hectic early phase of the pandemic. They are recommending that bars close, restaurants stop offering indoor dining. They believe schools can stay open because data shows the transmission rates there are relatively low. The health officials on the task force are urging Pence or Trump to stress to the public the importance of taking mitigation measures. And Scott Atlas, the president's controversial advisor, wasn't present at the meeting, and it's not clear if he participated remotely. Over at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, Rochester, Minnesota, more than 900 employees have contracted COVID-19 in the last 2 weeks. Dr. Amy Williams, Dean of Clinical Practice at the Mayo, said the vast majority of staff who were infected, 93%, were not infected at work. Really? The hundreds of employees who have contracted the virus over the last 2 weeks make up over a third of all the workers who've been infected since the start of the pandemic at the Mayo Clinic, and they have a shortage of 1,000 employees currently. It shows you how easy it is to get COVID-19 in the Midwest, Dr. Williams said during a press call. Our staff are being infected mostly due to community spread, and this impacts our ability to care for patients. Minnesota has seen a particularly alarming spike in cases over the last few weeks. The 7-day moving average for new cases is 7,400, the highest that it has been so far. And Chuck Grassley, the 87-year-old Republican senator from Iowa, he has moved from quarantine to reporting that he has tested positive for the coronavirus, and he will be resting at his home in Virginia. He was in the Senate. He voted on Monday. He opened the session. He has not disclosed how he has been exposed. And his absence yesterday helped Democrats with a vote from the vice presidential, what do we call her? The rising vice president, Kamala Harris. And because Grassley wasn't there, the nomination of Judy Shelton, Trump's controversial pick for the Federal Reserve, was not approved. So we now have kind of a competition between Moderna and Pfizer over who can rush to the arms of Americans a coronavirus vaccine. And as I've expressed, I'm deeply uncomfortable with this rush. Corners have already been cut, and more will be sawed off in the foreseeable future. So we get a little more information, and I have to say that these numbers have been shifting. Moderna recruited 30,000 volunteers across the U.S. to participate in its trial. A quarter of the participants are 65 plus. White people make up 63% of the volunteers, 20% Hispanic, 10% black, 4% Asian. The 95 people who got sick with COVID-19 reflect the diversity of the volunteers. 15 were 65 plus, and the group included 12 Hispanics, 4 blacks, 3 Asians, and 1 multiracial person. But researchers will have to wait for the trial to advance further to confirm the finding and the safety issues. And we need to stress that we have seen press releases from both Moderna and Pfizer. And each time they put out a press release about how great things are in the vaccine development game, their stock prices go up, their executives sell shares and cash in. And it's disgusting to see that, but it's also alarming. Because if they really believe in what they are doing in the laboratories, wouldn't they want to hold on to those shares because they're going to go even higher? If their vaccines work without serious side effects, and they have a worldwide market, the U.S. is already pre-purchased so that if you choose to get a vaccine from Moderna or Pfizer, both doses should be free. So I leave it to people to make their own decisions. But I share with you my concern that this is being rushed, and that is not a good thing. So Pfizer said today that its vaccine is now 95% effective. It was at 90 or something the other day. They also say it has no serious side effects. They're rushing over to the FDA, asking for emergency approval pronto. The data show the vaccine prevented mild and severe forms of COVID-19. It was 94% effective in older adults. But again, this is not peer-reviewed. We don't have the full information on the studies and side effects. They haven't been testing it long enough to determine anything beyond short-term side effects. And over at Yale, Dr. Saad Omer said that it's reassuring to see these developments, but he's called on Pfizer to quickly release a more detailed analysis of their data beyond the initial news release so that scientists can thoroughly evaluate the results. And I hope they are forthcoming, both from Pfizer and from Moderna. So Google Maps is now going to display the number of COVID-19 cases in the area that you select. The app will display the total number of cases and deaths up to the present, and a 7-day trend indicating if the numbers are going up or down. Back in August, Google rolled out a feature that lets you find hotels allowing free cancellation during the pandemic. In September, they introduced a COVID-19 layer in Maps to assist people in finding containment zones. They're also rolling out its crowdedness feature. This will allow users to get information on the level of congestion on public transit. It's kind of like Waze, where the people who are already on the bus or train or ferry, they will then post information on whether they consider it to be safe, depending on the relative crowding that they observe. And in Texas, more than 7,400 people are hospitalized for COVID-19. The positivity rate has exceeded 10% for over 3 weeks. But Governor Greg Abbott says no lockdown is coming. He's interfered with the officials in El Paso who have tried to impose local restrictions, and it is just idiocy if you ask me. Julian Assange is still incarcerated at the Belmarsh prison in southeast London. And now 3 prisoners in his block have tested positive for COVID-19. So they have locked them down even more. I mean, Assange was on that kind of restriction where he only was out to walk around in a restricted area for an hour a day and maybe get a shower. Well, information released by friends of Assange indicate that all prisoners and staff are being tested for COVID-19 at the prison. Within his cell block, all exercise has been stopped, showers are prohibited, and meals are being delivered directly to the cells. If you'll indulge me, I want to bitch and moan a little bit about Apple iPhones and iPads. I use them, and I generally like them. But Apple has this really annoying habit of forcing you to update the operating system. And this morning we were getting ready to go live on Facebook video with a Spanish language community radio show we produce here at the Secret Studio on Wednesdays. And the iPad that we use to control everything suddenly decided to update the operating system and locked us out of all other applications. Now, we developed a workaround to that. But the other gripe I have is that Apple recently forced me to update the operating system on my phone. And today, it activated one of the features, telling me that I should turn it on so it will collect proximity data on other iPhones near me. And if anybody gets the COVID, then we can open up these data files and do some contact tracing. And I am extremely uncomfortable with this because I don't believe that our data are protected. And here's a story that came from the motherboard section of Vice News. The U.S. military is buying the granular movement data of people around the world harvested from innocuous-seeming apps. The most popular app among a group of motherboard analyzed, connected to this sort of data sale, is a Muslim prayer and Quran app that has more than 98 million downloads worldwide. Others include Muslim Mingle, a popular Craigslist app, and an app for following storms, and a level app that allows you to use your phone to see if, a table or shelf is actually level. And it turns out that a product called Locate X, run by a company called Babel Street, collects all that location data, and they sell it to commercial firms, to advertisers, people who want to get you to come and buy a car or whatever it happens to be. But the U.S. military and the Special Operations Command is a major customer of Babel Street. And they want to assure you that the military only uses this to track people outside the United States. But it's really insidious. And while people can put the gloss of a public health emergency and protecting people from COVID over that app that has popped up on my iPhone because it automatically updated the operating system, we don't have any way to opt in or opt out of the buying and selling of our location data. And I don't know about you, but every time I have a chance, I say no when it asks if I want to share my location data. But if you're on Muslim Mingle or some sort of a Quran study group, it probably doesn't ask you that. As I get ready to retire, one of the things I plan to do is travel when the travel restrictions are lifted. I'm a scuba diver, and I've been out of action for a couple of years now for various reasons. But when I get back underwater, the coral reefs across the world have declined exponentially. And along the coastline of Florida and the Florida Keys, as much as 98% of the coral is basically dead. This is a new report from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency. They analyzed records from 2012 to 2018, and where it used to be acidification, pollution that placed risks at the health to the health of these reefs, they conclude that it's now all directly related to climate change. The twin threats of temperature-related bleaching and increased ocean acidification, both caused by climate change, can destroy coral reef ecosystems regardless of their location or their proximity to human populations. And along the Florida coast, additional stressors of water pollution, new development, overfishing, and disease outbreaks mean that even remaining coral cover is inadequate and unhealthy. And they're not just beautiful when you look at coral reefs. They are a critical ecosystem that supports a lot of sea life that is critical to the chain of underwater critters and the markets of fisheries that really rely on the coral reefs for sustenance. And finally today, I don't consider this news, but it's a confirmation that working women, particularly those who are mothers, are taking the hardest hits from COVID and the economic downturn. Parts of the economy that were smacked hardest and earliest by job losses were ones where women dominate: restaurants, retail, healthcare. Then a second wave began taking out local and state government jobs, another area where women outnumber men. And then the closing of child care centers and schools has saddled working moms much more than fathers with overwhelming household responsibilities. And it may be years before we get back to where we were in terms of female employment, parity with male co-workers, It's a huge setback. And so I don't want to leave you bummed out about that. I want to tell you a story about Wesley. He's our neighbor. He's 3 years old. And Brian and Carrie are his parents. And because of COVID, we haven't been able to interact with Wesley very much. When we're out on walks and they're out on walks, we say hi. But we can't really visit. We've given Wesley some books. And recently, Brian and Carrie were explaining to Wesley the outcome of the election, the historic breakthrough of Kamala Harris as a woman of color being elected vice president. And they told Wesley that when he grows up, he could be president if he wants to. And Carrie reported that Wesley's answer was, well, does that mean that Peter and Kathy, that's my partner, that they could be president too? That's my Art Linkletter moment for today. Thanks to Wesley. And thank you for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. Only a week remaining here. You'll find it on YouTube. You can share it with anybody. And I am Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.